Now on Daf Dalid Omid Beis. Boy of Yosef. Yosef had the following suffix. Ein Charisha b'Shabbos Mao. Let's say the Bezdin denied the malacha of Charisha, one of the 39 malachas. So they said it's mutter. Mi Amrin, should we say, came into Kamodu Bekulu Milsa? They admit that there is an entity of Shabbos with regard to 38 out of 39 malachas. Therefore, Chayav, therefore they should bring a carbon Parhelm Dov Shotzi because it's bittul miktas v'kiyum miktas. Oh, what should we say? Kevan de ka akrayin leila charisha kol ikar kakiras gufa damin. So let me try to give you my perspective on Rav Yosef. I think what Rav Yosef is wondering about is whether each malach of the 39 generates or steps out as a separate isur. I mean, the Torah just says, Kol malach lo tasu, but it's as if the Torah is saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do. Each one of the 39 malachas is an entity and an isur unto itself. For example, just to quote a famous shita that Tosfos read in Shabbos, he says that when you give a hasra and you want a person, you have to mention the name of the Av. It's not enough just to say, as the Minchas Chinuch holds, Al techalas haShabbos. You have to say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do zriya, don't do ktsira, don't do charisha. And therefore, as far as the Isa Charisha as an independent, separate entity of Shabbos, they were Oker Kula, and they should be potter. Toshma yesh nida b'Torah, aval haba al shaveres yom keneged yom potter, ha'akaryon l'shaveres yom keneged yom kol ikar. Even though the Iser of Zava Gedola, of Zava Ketana, in the case of shaveres yom keneged yom, is a separate entity, and therefore, even though they were oker, that entire entity, that entire Isa, they permitted. Nevertheless, they're chayav because they admit that there's such a thing as nida, and therefore, in your case where they were matir charisha, we should say they're chayav. And the Gemara says, Rav Yosef says that's midami. That's no comparison. Why? Shomeres yom dekamina and kidshanina. We already get an answer about Shomeres yom, and we said that they admit that there is an Isur Shomeres yom, like the Tzdukim would admit also because that's in the Torah. But the issue is whether or not she saw during the day or saw during the night. Toshma, I'll bring you a proof from Yeshavas B'Torah Motzi Mishusa Yachlu Shusa Harabim Patur. They're being oker the malacha of Hotzah, and yet they're chayav. We gave an answer to that. They didn't say that Hotzah in general is mutter, and they took a whole malacha out of the package and were matir. No, they just said that if you take it out, you're chayav, but if you take it in, you're potter. They are completely removing and permitting the Isur of Ishtachava, and yet the Chayav a carbon parhel dov shel tzibur. And the Gemara says, Hami Ishtachava, Nami Kiddush Hanina, and we already answered that either it was not the Kedarka of that Avodah Zorah, or it wasn't Pishud Yadayim V'Raglayim, and that's something that even the Tzdukim could justify their error. Now, I'm a little bit confused about one thing over here. The Tzdukim apparently observed the Shabbos. In fact, the Tzdukim were even more machmir than the Chachamim with regard to Moleches Havara. They didn't even allow you to light a fire before Shabbos. And how does that work? The Tzdukim only accepted Torah Shebechsav. They rejected Torah Shebal Peh. How did they know that when the Torah says Lo Tasa Kol Malacha B'Shabbos, the Torah meant these 39 categories of malacha? And perhaps the answer is because even the Tzdukim had what's called smichus haparshios. In other words, they also read the written scriptures in a way that there had to be some sort of logical connection between two parshios that are written contiguously, one next to the other. And here you have the Mishkan that's written contiguous to Shabbos, and therefore any malacha that was done in the Mishkan is also on Shabbos. I don't know. Boy, Rab Zera has a suffix. Ein Shabbos b'Shvius Mahu. What happens if Bezdin gives Hora that you have to observe the Shabbos for 6 out of 7 years of the Shemitah cycle, but on the 7th year, we have reason to believe that there's no Shabbos. No Shabbos during the 7th year. But my toe, how did they come to such a very strange conclusion that once in 7 years there's no Shabbos? But they mistakenly read a pasuk, v'charish v'katzir tishbos. The Torah is saying that you should be shoves from that which is mutter, charisha, etc. And 6 out of 7 years of the cycle, you are permitted to do charisha. And the Torah says tishbos. On Shabbos, once every 7 days, don't do charisha. The other 6 days of the week, you do charisha. It's mine to leka charisha, but for the year of Shemitah, the entire year of Shemitah, the 7th year, there's no charisha. So there's no tishbos. And you can't read the pasuk, becharish tishbos, on the 7th year, because in the 7th year, after all, you're anyway not doing Meleches Charisha the entire week from Sunday till Friday. So there's no new Tishbos on the 7th day, and therefore it's not included in the Torah's Shvisa. And therefore, like a Shabbos. And apparently, the Tzdukim might have also accepted this erroneous, mistaken understanding of the Torah. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Mi amrina. Kevin the Mekayim Lecha Lo B'Shar Shnei HaShavua Kibidol Miktzas V'Kiyum Miktzas O Dilma Kevin the Ka'akrin Le B'Shvius Ka'kiris HaGuf Dami. Okay, you justified how the Bezdin came to this mistaken conclusion that there's no Shabbos during the 7th year. Fine. But we always said that if they're oker the entire mitzvah, then there's no chiyuv. So I don't know how to analyze the case where 6 out of 7 years there is Shabbos, but 1 year for that entire year there's no Shabbos. Is that called akira b'miktas or is it akiras haguf? Avina, I'll bring you an analogy from Navi Shenisnavi Lakar Dover Mi B'Divrei Torah. The Torah says that we put to death a false prophet who tried to uproot something from the Torah. And what does that mean? Lebitol miktas, ulekir miktas. Let's say, for example, the Navi Sheker says, yeah, idolatry is prohibited, but not in this particular case. Reb Shimon Omer Potur. Reb Shimon Omer that the Navi is Potur, he doesn't get put to death. Right, the Pasuk says, Ach ha-Navi asher yozid ledaber dover b'shmi. And what does dover mean? Dover means the entire dover, not just a fraction, not just a segment. And therefore, if he only uproots a segment, Rabbi Shimon says he's potter because that doesn't come under ledaber dover. Ubavodas kolchavim, afilu omer hayom ovda lemocher botla chayev. He says the following. It's an interesting nevuah. We've discussed in the previous Masechta something called bittul. You can nullify avodah zarah. So the Navi says, you know what? Worship this idol on a temporary basis and then nullify it. And by nullifying it, you're being Mekayim a mitzvah. This is what the Torah, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from you. In such a case, he's chayav. Even though for X number of days, he's telling you to worship this idol. Shma mina, ein Shabbos b'shvius kebitul miktas the Kiyum Mitzvah, that in the case where the courts ruled that on every seventh year you're allowed to violate the Shabbos, there's no Shabbos, they will be chayav because they're only removing Shabbos on a temporary basis once every 7 years, but not for the rest of the 6 years. And that's similar to a Navi who tells you that you should worship this idol on a temporary basis. And he's chayav. The prophet is chayav, although he doesn't totally disregard the Isser of Avodah Zarah, because regarding a prophet who persuades others to commit idolatry, the Torah says that he will be put to death. And it says he tries to subvert you from the path. And from the path implies that he spoke to subvert another one from even just part of the path, and he's still chayim. So that concept of part of the path has its parallel in our sugi of Parahelim Dovashal Tzibur, where the ruling of Bezdin was to remove the prohibition partially. And temporarily is considered partially because the rest of the 6 years or the rest of after he worships the idol, is mutter. That's only partial, and that's enough to be mechayiv. Shema mina. Mishnah says, Horu bezdin v'yoda echad mehem sheto. One of the members of the court knows that they're making a big mistake. He tells them that they're making a mistake. Now notice, he did not remove himself from the vote. Because if he removes himself from the vote, then there's no unanimous decision, and we've already discussed that Parahelim Dovashal Tzibur is contingent and conditional on a unanimous vote. He's part of the vote, but he criticizes them, and he says they're making a mistake. And again, there's no Parahelim Dovashal Tzibur because the very fact that he dissents, that dissension is itself sort of, to some extent, he's removing himself from the final ruling of the decision that you're allowed to do X, Y, or Z. Another case where you're potter, Oshe lo haya mufla shel bezdin sham. Every Sanhedrin had a mufla. Now, he was the Rosh Hashiva, he was the great giant scholar. They used to confer with him on any complicated issue to get his advice and his insight, and he wasn't there. So the Bezdin issued the ruling without conferring with the Mufla Shel Bezdin. That's not enough to constitute a horah that generates a chiyuv Parahelim Dovashal. Oshayech mehem, one of the members of the court was disqualified. He was a ger, he was a mamzer, he was a nosin. And the Gemara is going to have to derive how we know that these categories of individuals cannot qualify as judges. Oh, Zakin Shelo Roy Lebonim. Okay, this is very complicated. And this basically has to be understood in the light of a sugya elsewhere. Where is that sugya? Just 1 second. I believe it's in Sanhedrin, but it'll come up soon. No, where is it? Just 1 second. I mean, now I'm. All right, you know what? It's going to actually come up in the Gemara. So we'll wait for the Gemara. Is Hareza Pot. In all the above cases, we don't have a complete decision and a ruling of all the judges on the Sanhedrin. meaning judges that qualify to be judges. There's no power helim dov shel tzibur. Shenemar, and we're going to derive this from Gzeira Shava. Nemar lahalon eda. So that lahalon is a parsha in the Torah that speaks about a capital crime that's being judged by the court, by the high court. And there too, we find the word Eda. It says there in Bamidbar Perek Lamed Hey, it says V'shaftu ha'eda v'tzilu ha'eda, to save a person who's accused of violating a capital crime. Ma Eda amur lahalon, just like in the parasha of V'shaftu ha'eda v'tzilu ha'eda. Kulam ruyun lahara, we must have a bezdin, which is called an Eda, that's completely qualified to hand down a capital decision, a ruling. Af Eda Murakan, so too here in Parahelim Dovashal Tzibur, where it also uses the word Eda, we derive the conclusion that Kulam Ra'uyim Lahora. They all have to be qualified for Hora. Now, let's just see what time it is. Okay, we don't have time, but there's a long discussion here about why we need this Gzeira Shava. What would have been the svara to say that there would be a chiyuv par helim dovashal tzibur if you don't have a unanimous decision? We've already decided that you need a unanimous decision. So there's a very, very lumdisha answer to this question. And if I understand correctly, it's based on the Chazon Ish, that there are two ways of learning Eda. You could have learned Eda means you have X number of people who are involved in the process of not giving a ruling, but in the process of deciding that something is prohibited or permitted. And a mamzer and a nosin, etc., they can decide, like let's say, for example, I have a suffix on a piece of meat, whether it's kosher or treif, I can go to a mamzer and he'll decide for me. The fact that he's a mamzer is only a psul in Bezdin. So the havamina before this Gzeira Shava to V'shaftu Eda would have been that even someone who's puzzled and disqualified as a member of the court, nevertheless, since he has the status of someone who could paskin, so to speak, on an Isa v'het to Shaila, that's enough. Oh, shalo hoya mufla shel bezdin sham. You know how do we know the summer of sheshes? Why does it say horu? B'davish stukim modim bo pturim. Why is it if something that even the stukim know that this is a mistake, the court is not chayav because they should have learned this is not a justifiable toes. So too, lo hayu mufla shel bezdin sham nami pturim shahayu lehem lilma v'lolamdu. They should have gone out of their way to, send a document, to an email to the mufla shebet bezdin and asked him for his opinion before they went ahead and handed down their ruling. So therefore, it's not considered a justifiable toast. Nemar sham eda v'nemar kana eda. Achi kulam ru'uyim lahora. Chasam minolan. Tiamar av chizam akrav es yatzvu sham ima. That the judges should stand together with you. You meaning Moshe Rabbeinu. Imcha b'dom lecha. Just like you have no blemish in your yuchsin, there's no psul, you're not a mamzer or nosin, and so forth and so on. You have pure genealogy, and therefore, and they also, the judges, this is in the parasha of Yisro, they also have to be like you, Maybe it means that they're with you, and just like you're not going into the Kodesh Kadoshim, to the Shekhinah, they too will not go in. Okay, fine. The Mishnah says, Horu Bezdin Shogigin, V'yosu Kolakol Shogigin, is Meviyim Par. So if the Bezdin, as a whole, issued a verdict, a ruling, permitting something which is prohibited, an erroneous decision, and the majority of the people of Israel followed that ruling, even though it says in the Mishnah Kol HaKol, but Rubo Kekulo, therefore it uses the word Kol, the majority of the community, based on the ruling of Bezdin, they violated, let's say, Chelev, Meviyim Par. Mezidim, however, if the court was deliberate in their mistaken decision. Now, the Mefarshim say that can't be. I mean, we're talking about Sanhedrin Agdolah. But Mezidim means Kim Mezidim. They're like a Mezid because they should have known better. Now, V'yosu Shogigim, and now the Kohol went ahead and followed that erroneous decision. Is there Mevim Kizbo Seira, the members of the community could not have relied on the ruling of Bezdin, because the ruling of Bezdin was b'mezid, as we said before, Kim Mezid, and therefore it's not a valid. So each one is chayav for his own personal chatas for eating chelev b'shogig, and he brings a kizba and a seir. Shogigin. Now we have the exact reverse situation where the Bezdin was, so to speak, justified in their mistake. So there is a chaloshem toes, but asu mezidin, the people themselves violated it b'mezid, meaning they knew that this was chelev, and yet they went ahead and they ate it. Harei l'pturim. They don't have the ability and the rights to bring a karban chatas for an atonement because they were mezidim, and a karban chatas is only for a shogeg. Now the Meiri says that there are two conditions to understanding how the public sinned deliberately. Number one, they knew that this was a mistake. They knew that there's no obligation on their part to implement an erroneous decision. That makes them into mezid, and they don't have the ability of bringing a karban chatas of a yachid. So the Gemara now is medayik. Shogeg and v'yasu mezidim harei l'pturin hashogeg dumya de mezid chayev hechidami shahoru bezdin shechelev muter v'nischalif lo shuman v'acholo. Okay, fine. Bezdin gave them a ruling that they're allowed to eat chelev, but the reason why they ate the chelev is not because they were relying on the ruling of Bezdin. We discussed this at great length, but rather because they thought that this was chelev. They thought this was shuman and not chelev. So then they have to bring their own personal korban. Lema tifshar hadabai Rav Mechaber. Maybe now we have an answer to Rami Bar Bachama's question. But in this very case, where the individual had his own shkaga of nischalif lo shuma b'shuman, is he chayav v'chatas when he could have relied on Bezdin who made a mistake? Rambam says that you cannot draw any conclusions from a Mishnah mishum de tana reisha mezidim v'yasu shkagim tana seifa shogim v'yasu mezidim. The Mishnah says, and with this we'll conclude, Horu Bezdin v'yasu kol hakol aruban al piem mevim par ubavodas kol chavim. The deal is a little bit different. If the Bezdin would matir avodah zarah mevim par v'soyer, and this is a chiyuv on the court itself, the members of the court have to bring a par and a soyer. However, the tzibur doesn't bring anything because it's going to be a carbon tzibur and not an individual chiyuv. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and he holds it's not a carbon that's brought by the Bezdin, such that now the individuals are potter. No. It goes according to the Shvatim. And the Shvatim will tell us whether or not it's a majority of the congregation, and that's going to be the Machayev of Parhelm Davtim, and therefore Shneimasa Shvatim Mivim, Shneimasa Parim. Right? Each one of the Shvatim have to bring their own par. It's not the par of the Bezdin, but the par of the Kohol, and each Shevet is a Kohol unto itself. Uvavodos Kol Chavim, Mivim Shneimasa Parim, Ushneasar Seirim. So that special carbon of a par v'sa'ir in a case of violating avodas kol chavim inadvertently is a chiyuv on the individuals, and therefore the shvatim have to bring that carbon, and therefore they'll bring 12 parim and 12 se'ir. Okay, then, so that's where we'll conclude for today, and I think I'll see you on Sunday, correct?